Thank you, Roshni, and everyone for joining us today. Before we begin the panel discussion, here is a small introduction on the topic for today. Hi everyone. So today we're going to be speaking about protected areas, human rights, and its interlinkage with India's global commitments under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So to understand this subject more, we would briefly look at the CBD, the KMGBF or the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the Target 3, and what India says about protected areas framework. If to let you all know, Convention on Biological Diversity or CBD was introduced in 1992 and it was adapted by India as well. And it is a legally binding international treaty aimed at conserving biodiversity, promoting sustainable resource use, and ensuring fair and equitable benefit sharing from genetic resources. Cut to 2022 when the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework or KMGBF was adopted, of which India is again a party. Now, the core mandate for KMGBF are set in 4 overarching goals for 2050 and 23 action-oriented targets for 2030. To briefly go into the KMGBF goals, first of all, talks about protecting, managing, and restoring ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. Then it goes into managing biodiversity sustainably and protecting nature's ecosystem services. Goal C goes into fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. And goal D is about securing technology, funding, and other resources required to implement these targets in its letter and spirit. When we zoom in now to Target 3, its main mandate is to conserve at least 30% of terrestrial, inland water, coastal, and marine areas by 2030. It does this by 2 methods. One is to rely on already declared protected areas, which are ecologically representative and well connected. And the other pathway is through other effective area-based conservation measure. The most important thing about Target 3 is it demands explicit recognition and respect for rights, lands, and traditional territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. There are also, as I mentioned, 23 targets. So there are targets linked with Target 3, which is targets 1 and 2, target 22 and 23, and targets 8 and target 10. There are resources shared at the end of these slides, and you may go through the resources to understand the rest of the targets. Now we zoom in further into India's actions. And so India's commitments are implemented at the national level through something called the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. The link for the same is also put here as a reference. It adopted its NBSAP in 2008, and once it adopted KMGBF at the international level, it updated its NBSAP by 2024. So as per this NBSAP, India claims to cover 22% of its terrestrial area and 5% of coastal or marine areas under formal protection. The NBSAP also talks of 2 governance models. One is protected areas and managed forests. Managed forests include reserve forests and protected forests. And the second model is autonomous community efforts, co-management of forests, and decentralized governance of biodiversity. To bridge the gap towards Target 3, India's NBSAP specifically refers to OECMs or other effective area-based conservation measures, community reserves, and sacred groves without depending solely on strict state-enforced protected areas. There are also a list of laws which are referred to within the NBSAP, which deal with protected areas specifically. So they include the Wildlife Protection Act for national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, conservation and community reserves, and tiger reserves. Then comes the Indian Forest Act with its reserve forests, protected forests, and village forests. The Biological Diversity Act with its biodiversity heritage sites. Environment Protection Act for its eco-sensitive zones and coastal regulation zones. And lastly, the Wetland Rules of 2017, which notify wetlands. Now, despite these global commitments and the national laws that I have just mentioned, the on-ground situation remains tense. And there are instances of rights violation that we can note even to this day, especially when it comes to rights of tribals and local communities who are living in the vicinities of protected areas and tiger reserves. Thus, our objective here is to understand to what extent the human right-based approach and Target 3 mandates equitable governance of protected and conserved areas in India. Moving on to our so today's webinar brings together voices from the ground and perspectives from policy, research, and practice to reflect on this question. We'll begin with the panel discussion now. Welcoming our first panelist for the day, Dr. Madegowda. Dr. Madegowda is a postdoctoral fellow and coordinator at ATRI's BR Hills Field Station with 24 years of experience working with Indigenous communities and biodiversity conservation in Karnataka. His work focuses on participatory resource monitoring, sustainable use of minor forest produce, sacred site mapping, community conservation, Forest Rights Act implementation, and strengthening Indigenous community movements. Dr. Madegowda, thank you for being here. Now, the question to you is, FRA could be considered as one of the laws in India which comes closest to achieving human rights-based approach and about recognition of rights within protected areas. So in this context, the question to you is, after communities received community forest rights, what challenges do they continue to face in exercising those rights in and around protected areas and tiger reserves in your experience? Please also share any suggestions on the kind of support that is required by communities to help exercise their human rights, especially from an equitable and gender-sensitive lens. Dr. Madegowda, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now I'm in the BRT. So I'm working from the BRT Tiger Reserve in Chamraj district. We have 4 protected areas in Chamrajnagar and the BRT Temple Tiger Reserve. So then we have Bandipura Tiger Reserve and Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary and Malemadesha Wildlife Sanctuary. All the 4 protected area, our Adivasi community called Soligaru and Jenukurba, Betakurba, 3 forest-based tribal community living in this landscape for centuries. And our Adivasi community level depend on the minor forest product. So according to our ATRI research, we did around 60% income the people used to get from the minor forest product. This is one of the major sources. And also around 40% people having land and remain almost 60% are landless families. All of them are dependent on the minor forest product. This is playing the very important role in the tribal economy in Solig also. And so we started working on a FRA, Forest Rights Act in the BRT Tiger Reserve. And we got it is difficult to get the rights because this is a tiger reserve. So always the forest department put the objection in the district level forest right committee and sub-divisional forest right committee. But we, the Adivasis, are the member in the SDLC and DLC. So we put the pressure to, we use all the political lobby and the bureaucracy. And in that, ultimately we got the rights for the 25 Grama Sabhas initially in the BRT Tiger Reserve, 2011. So again, till date, around 48 Grama Sabhas received the committee forest right in the Tiger Reserve out of 61 settlements. And also we also working in the Malemars Wildlife Sanctuary. There are 56 settlements. After that, only 25 Grama Sabhas received the community forest right. It cover almost 40 villages. And also, we also working on the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. There we have around 4 settlement Adivasi Uliga communities. So there also we got the 4 CFR rights for them. And another that in the Bandipura Tiger Reserve, there are 33 settlements and distributed in the that Bandipura Tiger Reserve. They were rehabilitated very long back, 1974, when they declared Tiger Reserve. And now we are applying for the committee forest, right? It's difficult to get the rights. There are 22 Grama Sabhas applied. All the application at the CLC level. After getting the rights, some challenges we had only because after getting the rights, people go collecting minor forest products that is allowed. And some places, the new forest department officials came and they need to understand the policy. That is the challenge we have. Is to understand the field staff. Many field staff don't know the Forest Site Act and rules and titles and everything. They came up with the Wildlife Protection Act background and all the training will given them on the Wildlife Protection Act only. So that is the challenge we have. And some places we got the fishing rights. Some places we are able to do the fishing work, collection, fishing, rearing, all the thing. Some places it's difficult to still today. So we are approaching the government. That is another challenge we have. This is about the CFR rights and in all 3 protected area. So now currently we are prepared the community-based conservation plan, the CFR plan for 8 forest right committees in BRT Tiger Reserve. And we had a lot of workshop with the community, FRC members, president and Grama Sabha members. Almost 3 to 4 years we had a lot of discussion looking into the conservation point and what are the threat to the forest area. So we identify number of threat to the forest area. What is the solution for the community? So we have list of and also the livelihood and management. 3 components we added that in the plan. And recently, last month, we had a Grama Sabha meeting and we submitted the plan. The plan has submitted to SDLC committee. The SDLC committee has to approve it and then has to send to the DLC to approve it. So then we can implement at the grassroots level. So that is the plan we approach and that is the status now.
As a follow-up, Dr. Madegowda, do you have any examples of some conservation practices which are now being included within these plans? And whether there are any challenges from the department side or from any of the authorities in implementing that plan?
So usually there is a 2-3 components. One is a lantana camera weed as an increase in the forest area. That is the challenge we have because the native species are decreasing in the forest area. And the Adivasi community is also not able to get the resource like a tubers, green leaves, or mushroom, all the product. That is the challenge we have. So we need to remove. And traditionally, these oligar are indigenous community to manage the forest. There's a litter file called. That is the litter file practice is the traditional practice. So it's not acceptable by under the Wildlife Protection Act. And we put one of the point in the plan. So that we want to remove the lantana from the forest area by cutting method and removing the root. And then we use the litter fire. We make a small lantana bushes and make a foot the fire, litter fire. So that is the one of the point we are, because this is our traditional method that through that we can conserve the forest area. Only that is the challenge we have. So the forest department or policymaker will accept that plan or not, we don't know. So that is one of the component out of 12 components. So others are okay. Plastic removing, poaching, all the other activities are okay. Bunding, restoration activities are okay. But
Okay.
I think when the meeting will happen, then we'll know.
Okay. And in terms of the committee setup, how is the participation of women? I mean, is there women participation? Is there a gender sensitive approach to planning?
So women are actively participating in our Grama Sabha meeting and even the plan preparation also. We kept a record also how many people are participating. And whenever we have a meeting, we invited all the FRC committee members. And even general meeting, we used to gather to 200 people and present the plan and concern get the feedback from them. So what suggestion they are giving, based on that we prepare the plan.
Okay. And last question to you, Dr. Madegowda, in terms of any support that the communities require, like are there, apart from financing or funding, are there any other supports that are required by the communities in your understanding?
So currently we need financial support, but after submitting the plan, I discussed with already state tribal director, Karnataka, and the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. Anyway, they are giving 15 lakh for the restoration activity. We approached, and the director also told me us to send the plan to them. So we are planning to send it by next month and get some grant from them. And also we are approaching, there is a solar trust, Thors Takekar. He is doing lantern removing activities in the BRT Tiger Reserve. And they are making all the lantern into briquettes and making and supplying outside. They are providing employment to our Soliga community, the removing lantana, but they're getting some grant from outside. So now we had a discussion with him. He also called me many times and we had a discussion. Currently they are doing with them their NGO. So now they are going to shifting to the all Grama Sabhas. So I think these two plans are there. So we're going to get it some support from them and grant from them to do that grassroots level. And also we are planning to get some grant from the maybe not grant, like using the NREG scheme for the implementation of co-management plan.
All right. Thank you for sharing your observations, Dr. Madegowda. Dr. Madegowda had to leave for a meeting at 11:30, so we'll let you go now. Thank you so much for your inputs.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, that was Dr. Madegowda, and we had some very valuable insights from him. Now, moving on to our second panelist, Dr. Pradeep Sarmokadam. Welcoming you to the session, sir. Dr. Sarmokadam is a member secretary of the Goa State Biodiversity Board, which is responsible for biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and equitable benefit sharing in Goa. And his work is largely built around decentralized biodiversity governance through biodiversity management committees and people's biodiversity registers, as well as state-level biodiversity policy and planning. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sarmokadam. Our question for you is as follows. Biodiversity heritage sites provide an example where areas of ecological and cultural importance can receive legal recognition and also meet Target 3 expectations while remaining connected to local communities. So what are some lessons from BHS designation that could inform more participatory approaches to area-based conservation targets? Secondly, if it is appearing that this is a good model, then why is it not appropriate in your understanding for protected areas like national parks, sanctuaries, and tiger reserves? Over to you, Dr. Pradeep.
Yes, thank you. It's a good topic that we are discussing today on Target 3. And when we talk about biodiversity heritage sites, for last 10 years, we have been working with biodiversity committees very closely. And we have been able to notify one only in Goa. Rest 5 to 6 are in progress. And Goa being a very, very sensible place, there is a large number of people who are ready to support the biodiversity heritage site, because we have mostly private properties. It is not that we just notify some area. People oppose also in a big number. For example, for last 10 years, we have connected 5 wetland and Khazan area, which we are trying to notify as a heritage site. So with the draft notification, before that also we had large level of consultations. We simply did not notify. We took lot of time to consult the local people, involve them, prepare the plan with them. So few farmers initially opposed certain areas to be put in because they said our fields are there, we don't want any regulation in our fields. So we explained that pre-existing rights and privileges will be protected, but still there, after draft notification also, there were some farmers who came and said that no, please remove our fields, we do not want heritage tag for our wetlands on our fields because we don't want any regulation to come. So we said that your existing practices will continue. They said, what if we want to bring in harvester? I said everything is allowed, we have put it in the notification, but still there is a fear that government should not come into our property. There is a fear behind notification, and that is what we faced when we notified 25 wetlands. What we found that each wetland, although we have notified, we have overruled and we have notified because there is a Supreme Court behind us. There is a act, rules which says that we have to notify wetlands. So whichever were identified by Space Application Center, again there is a problem. Now Space Application Center, over all India, they have identified more than 2 lakh 50,000 water bodies as wetland, which actually do not qualify as a wetland as per the wetland rules, because wetland rules only
Very
allow
true.
you to notify those which are not under CRZ or under wildlife protection. You have to identify and notify those which are not protected. So even in those, they are not permanent wetlands. So I am telling you, notification of heritage site, even in a private property where the private owner is ready that we can notify it, in such a case there is a group of people which is upstream, they are objecting because they said we want to make a road from there tomorrow, and if road is not made, our human rights are violated, and large people are tribals among them. So they say that we need road, so there is another possible road from other side. So we told them, please take the other side of the road. This is a very sensitive sacred grove of pandanus, let us declare it as a heritage site, because owner of that land is willing, he has given us all the documents, but the public is objecting. So sometimes I feel too many consultations, too many prior informed consent, mutual agreed, all the human rights, making everybody convinced that you want to declare. I think we will need 100 more years to notify more heritage sites. I am being very frank and blunt. But in case of our wetlands, we decided that this wetland needs conservation. May it be your private property, your plot will go, your house will not go, because pre-existing rights privileges are protected. Now if you have a house, nothing will happen, it will continue to exist. But if you have a plot in 50 meters, you cannot construct any permanent construction in future after we notify. Same thing happened when there was a CRZ. See, making rules policies is a very easy thing, because you do it in your desktop in the room. Implementing it on the ground, convincing every person on the ground and notifying it, there is a hell lot of trouble, especially when the land is not owned by government, the land is owned by private people. They have a fear that my family will grow, we will need four more small houses to come around us. So joint family is not there, we have broken families. So he says that if you notify this as a wetland or as a heritage site, what is the guarantee I will be able to construct in future? We say we will put it in the draft notification that you are allowed to construct your existing house, renovate, but new construction, are you allowing? If you say yes, some real estate builder will come, sign MOU with them, and they build constructions around that, which will not be for general purpose. So there are a lot of things we have to look at it when we are notifying. OECM looks to be a proper, relatively informal, but there are no national level guidelines where you can actually notify OECM. We are trying 2 3 OECMs, which are not actually a notified thing. It's like informal calling something. And the best thing I would say is the sacred groves which have been conserved over the generations without the presence of any rules or regulations. They are nicely preserved because they are connected with the beliefs of people, the taboos, the eco-cultural protocols, and they are doing well. And I think our job should be to only strengthen that. But again, you think of notifying it as a sacred grove, as a heritage site. Again, some surrounding people will come and say that, see, I am coming with a mining there. If you develop this, Mining will not be allowed to start. So there are many problems on the ground, but yes, there are solutions. When you constantly work with people, it takes time for the people to, you know, go with your um, approach, and it is a journey. It cannot happen overnight. That's what I feel. Thank you.
Sir, just one follow-up question. So when we are considering even a voluntary model like you've suggested, OECMs, how is participation to be ensured? Like, I know that it's voluntary to begin with, but in the long term, how do you ensure that there is a participatory approach? And
I
yeah,
think something that has been preserved for thousands of years has happened only because there was a community participation. It has not happened because government wanted it or some NGO came there and started working and then it happened. It is not like that. This was happening because people wanted to conserve it. They have conserved it. Now, if we bring the development Ganga into the village and we want all concrete things, then it is we who are talking about development, and people are still doing their houses as per their affordability. The moment they get lot of compensation and lot of money, lot of government jobs, we have seen that in the forest area they're all slab houses and concrete houses, and they want to put AC inside to keep it cool. Whereas those people who are moderate to middle class, they still have the Mangalore roofs. They are cool inside. They are still working in the field. They are healthy. So there is this tussle. How much development we are bringing into village? What type of development we bring? How do we plan our development? How many industries we want to bring in which areas? Depending on it will depend whether the sacred groves and these spaces will be conserved or not. Community participation will depend because community has protected. They are participating, but communities are getting fragmented day by day. There are people who are migrating out for the better prospects. Villagers left even are not able to do their routine rituals and festivals. There are very few people who are doing it. Only those festivals where there is lot of economy and things involved there, like Ganesh Chaturthi is happening in Goa and in other parts. Matoli is still happening. These are ecological things. But many things are now less participated. So same thing will happen for participatory conservation. We'll not be able to have huge scale of participatory conservation, but yes, if we do with people with consultation, it will take time. If you set me target, then within 2 years you notify all the wetlands, it will not happen. Let the people take time to understand that this notification is not bad. Let the rules say that yes, previously dwelling houses should be allowed to continue. The pre-existing rights also mean that somebody has a plot, cannot construct because he doesn't have money. Tomorrow he gets money, he should be allowed to build his house without polluting the wetland. Then people will be with us. So I think we have to have dynamic regulations which will work with the people, take the people into confidence. If we say that statutory bodies, we are on this side, people on that side, we versus you, nothing is going to work. That's what I feel.
thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We're very grateful that you could share your perspectives with us. Yeah, now moving on to our next panelist, Dr. Manish Chandy. Manish has worked in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands since the mid 1990s with the Andaman Nicobar Environment Team and the Nature Conservation Foundation. His expertise is relationships between communities and natural resources, including customary resource management and community based restoration in the Nicobar Islands. He currently lives in Goa as a consultant researcher. So, Manish, based on your experience from the islands and working closely with communities, to what extent do you think human rights is taken into account in protected areas of India, especially from an equitable and gender specific lens? Please provide any examples of rights violations that you may have observed, and specifically from a marine and coastal lens, if you can provide these examples, that will be great. And if you have any positive stories to share where the communities and government have collaborated in management, even that would be welcome. But please, over to you, Manish.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, from the islands for sure. I'll speak on from what I've learned and understood. But I also, at the outset, I would like to state that, I mean, around the world, around our planet, there are about 300,000 protected areas, of which about 15% of them are within indigenous territories, right? Am I right? Look at the
Yeah.
statistics, right or not? Yeah, sorry, 26% of them actually are overlapping with indigenous territories. And that makes a huge amount of, it brings about, shows a different perspective. To put in perspective, actually, what we're conserving is mostly lands that have been designated by us as organizations or groups or governments. And very often, more often than not, a lot of them kind of overlap and actually are include indigenous or tribal territories. So from the islands, we have about approximately about 100 odd protected areas, and none of those protected areas, including two marine reserves, compare in size and in biological diversity and in conservation of its resources in comparison to the tribal reserves in the islands, which seemingly are not included in the protected area network as a PA, but they are, I mean, called as tribal reserves. There's a Jarawa tribal reserve, there's a Ongi reserve, there's a Shompen or a Nicobar, Great Nicobar Tribal Reserve, the Nicobar Islands per se, all of them put together and so on. And in most of these places, we have more than 95 to 98% of forest. And invariably, for want of a lack of a better word, untouched, but used and consumed and managed by the local communities ever since they've always been on the islands and until we have known. So the Jarawa Tribal Reserve is one of the largest, is the largest tribal reserve in and the largest protected area in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Close behind is both the Ongi Reserve and the Great Nicobar Biosphere Reserve, which includes the tribal reserve as well. So, I mean, all I would say is, yes, these reserves hold a lot of biological diversity, and the very fact that they are what they are is only because of the ways of life that people have used, the way they've used those spaces. But that you can't compare that with, say, a mainland or even another island community, for instance. They're very specific, right? So I don't want to generalize, because it doesn't mean that all tribal protected areas have a large amounts of biodiversity and they're in tune with our conservation ethics and so on and so forth. It all is all very context and geographically the location specific in that sense. Secondly, like you also asked me of instances of when there are violations or even of positive stories, in a sense.
Yes.
Yeah, like very recently with this tenuous and project called the Great Nicobar Biosphere, a transshipment terminal project. Randomly, without consultation, just by using a process of law, just to appease lay people, they've declared 3 wildlife sanctuaries in the southern Nicobar, and that's happened without any consultation. On the other hand, all those 3 locations, and I've worked there extensively. I've spent more than 20 years around that space. They have always, without even knowing what the word conservation is, they don't even have a particular word that kind of fits into their dictionary or their vocabulary of conservation.
Manish, if I may just interject, if you could speak a little slower so that
Yeah,
our translator
sure.
can
I have,
follow.
yeah,
Sorry about that.
no,
Yeah,
I do speak
please carry
fast. I understand.
on. Please, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so these spaces have been declared or rather intended, or they've been declared as wildlife sanctuaries. On the other hand, an already a location which was designated or with an intention to declare it as a wildlife sanctuary, the Galatia Bay, has been denotified. So these are, I mean, it's this. I wouldn't say it's a policy or even a governmental decision straight out at the outset. There's a lot more at play beyond the veneer of government policy or even a project that is taking place and so on. There's lots more at play, and probably the webinar is not a right place to kind of point those things out. Anyway, but the point I'm trying to make is that people, like, for instance, the Galatia Wildlife Sanctuary was, I think the intention to notify it was way back sometime in the early 90s. And until 2018 or 19, whenever the denotification actually took place, they hadn't settled rights of the local communities. And those were indigenous communities, both include both the PVTGs at particularly vulnerable tribal groups, as well as scheduled tribes of Nicobaris, whose rights had not been settled. But all seemed kind of hunky-dory because it is far out there. We had a team out there who was actually monitoring and the turtles. I was further north doing the same thing further in Little Nicobar and so on. But no one took the onus or even took the responsibility of saying, let's kind of bring about this final notification for that place. So that's a flaw, I think, in the procedure. It's a procedural flaw. You intend to notify a place, you should actually have a certain time period. And I think the Wildlife Protection Act does stipulate some sort of period within which you can actually, or you should carry out the due
Finish.
processes, finish it out.
Yeah.
So it's been more than 20 years since that was declared, or at least the intention to declare it as a sanctuary. It's a very important spot and location for not just for leatherback turtles that nest there, but for a whole set of both the people, the indigenous people, as well as wildlife, and of course habitat and so on. So on the other hand, you also have, and I've remarked this in another interview very recently. You have a very different perspective. I'll provide you a different perspective. Before the tsunami took place in 2004, which is virtually like a fulcrum, a turning point for the Nicobar Islands in very many ways. And I had been working there prior to the tsunami as well. Governmental involvement was very, very minuscule. And not to say that they were not working in that area, they were. The Tribal Welfare Department was there, there was all the DC offices were there, but the entire process or outlook was not of interference. It was to say the entire administrative machinery understood that yes, these people are scheduled tribe community, and the areas have been declared as a tribal reserve. They have their own internal mechanisms of administration and their own land use practices and so on and so forth. So the entire gamut of livelihood on the islands was left to them to carry out as they have been conducting for the longest time. All that changed beyond 2004, probably around 2010, once the permanent shelters were handed over. And it's been kind of being fast-tracked even more as we speak, where there's a lot more interference in terms of procedural and bureaucracy that's coming in and so on. To contrast that, what Dr. Pradeep Samorkam had just to mention recently about Goa. I live in Goa as well, and it is very clear and very nice to see how actually what he said is very true. You have a very literate populace here, and also the fact that people are aware of what they have remaining, and therefore are happy to be part of a conservation measure in their own villages, in their own Kazan lands, and so on. Of course, there are the outliers who would want to sell out land to large builder lobbies and so on and so forth. It's also a very big problem currently as we speak. But the fact remains that yes, because I mean that people are aware and they know and they have a lot of respect and dignity for their own cultural perspectives. It's both Hindu, Christian, or Catholic, or even Muslim community, irrespective of religion or creed or whatever. They have a lot of respect and understanding of what they want to conserve and what they want to keep. I think that's the way. In fact, his team has also gone about building biodiversity registers for villages in Goa. It's had a very positive effect. Of course, like you said, it's going to take a lot more time for the panchayats and the Zilla Parishads to kind of put into place a lot of these processes which the biodiversity registers have been able to list out. But that process has begun. Now, let me take you also back to a very recent issue as the Cockroach Janta Party has brought about of talking about governmental schools and the right to education or improved and better education. There also was a WhatsApp meme that was floating around saying, how do you destroy a country? There are 3 or 4 steps, I forget the number of steps, that's immediately. The point is, if you lower the quality of education or you provide a very bare minimum of format of education, you are then going to result in the end result is of students who become adults, who then become either doctors, engineers, and so on and so forth. And then that the quality of education will reflect in what they do and how they were able to conduct their work. Now, you and I, all of us have been privileged to have been educated in good schools, probably, and have had access to that. A lot of the rural population and poorer communities in our country haven't had that. And that goes, and I bring this in because I think it has a very great relevance to our protected area network as well. Where people are aware of their rights and people are aware of the fact that they can do things on their own and so on and so forth. And which, if you look at the forest policies, I'm bringing in a lot of elements. the forest policies from 1894, the first one by Dr. Wokler, and then it was in 1952 was the revised independent India's first forest policy. Then went on to 1988, right?
88.
Yeah, 88, and then 2016 there was a draft. In 2018 the another one has come about. So you can see a whole transition in terms of how our government has actually incorporated the rights of local communities. Even the Wildlife Protection Act, for instance, it does give up the provision of saying to look at the settlement of rights of local communities, scheduled tribes and local communities in a protected in a landscape which is going to be deemed or is intended to be declared as a wildlife sanctuary and so on. So those are very positive formats that I would bring out, more than an example of a particular instance or a story, for instance. There are. But I think the larger picture is this, that we need to look at these policy instruments and also awareness of our communities, and then them being enabled or empowered to be able to bring about conservation measures, and not on our terms, but on their terms. That's much more important. And I would go back to the previous speaker again, Dr. Madegowda, who had also spoken. He's a Solika tribal himself, community himself. They have I've met some of those communities as part of my work as well on fire. And he mentioned that.
Manish, you have to slow down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He did mention the concept of surface fires or litter burning that he referred to.
Little fires. Yeah.
It's such an important component of how forests were used and managed. And in India, there's a fair amount of research that's kind of shaped up, good research that's shaped up that shows how fire has a place in our ecological inventory of managing ecosystems. And there's also this very seminal paper which I keep referring to by the guy called Stephen Pine in 1994, where he talks about how fires were part of our landscape in colonial India. And when the colonists came in, every province had complaints coming back to their centers in Bengal or wherever else, talking about them not being able to control the local communities setting fire to the landscapes. And fire was the chief enemy of the British because timber was their one of their primary products. That has seeped into how we have managed our ecosystem. And I'm using fire as an example. Fire is just one example where fire was continually used in our landscape. And we had many more tigers and elephants and insects and bird and fauna and flora, etc. The demographic of people also very, very different at that point of time, 100, 200 years ago. But the point I'm trying to make is this, that we have lost out on a lot of systems of practices that we have used, our ancestors have used in our landscapes. Which are actually, I think, beneficial. And we must kind of weigh the pros and cons of that in our present day context.
Manish, one more minute.
Yeah, one minute. The last point I would try to make is again go back to what Dr. Madegowda had said, which goes back to the rights of local communities. Are we willing to kind of hand over or be able to meld their own stewardship of these landscapes, whether they're marine, terrestrial, or otherwise? In the Nicobar Islands is full of a lot of spaces which are a lot of spaces in the marine areas, reefs especially, which are not fished in certain times of the year. We haven't mapped all of it. Vardhan has done a fair amount in Central Nicobar, and I've seen a couple for the north and south as well. And they actually hold a lot of biodiversity. And good that we haven't marked them out for declaration into sanctuaries or national parks and so on, because the people have their own mechanisms of forming and using and conserving those spaces. I use the word conservation, conserving those spaces in English. It's not necessarily a term that will be used by local communities. I think it's high time we kind of come to respect, and more than respect, actually implement and take onus with them on board. That's a very, very important fact. And so it's a big challenge, but it has to be done. There's no easy way out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Manish, for sharing your valuable experiences and the stories that you shared. Welcoming our fifth panelist, Stella James, to this session. Stella is an environmental justice practitioner, lawyer, and storyteller with extensive experience in environmental justice and conservation. And she's currently the program manager for Coexistence Champions, where she supports community-centered approaches to coexistence, governance, and conservation through the Coexistence Consortium. Stella, you're also a lawyer, and so with your law and policy background, as well as the work that you've done along with communities. The question to you would be, how does Indian law currently protect human rights within the protected area and tiger reserve? And what are the principal gaps in those legal safeguards that we have at the point? This is especially when it comes to implementation. The other thing would be if you have any examples of coexistence models that you've seen in protected areas, if you could share those, especially those that are from an equitable and gender specific lens. If there is some example like that, and if you could throw light on those. Yeah. Thank you, Stella.
Thanks, Shama. Yeah, I think adding on to a lot of what people have been saying so far as well. I think in India, one of the considerations is in terms of the way the history of laws has really sort of gone, right? So what that has meant in terms of the way protected areas is looked at is that when we say protected areas, I mean, immediately what we jump to is the Wildlife Protection Act. And please tell me if I'm talking too fast or too slow or anything.
Yeah, just slow down a tad. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
A tad, yeah.
Yeah. So when you look at the Wildlife Protection Act, it does use the word rights in certain places, very limited, but it's not actually a framework of rights, and it's not actually a rights-based approach. It's primarily a system of prohibition of what can you do or rather what you can't do in areas that are protected areas. And in that system, it creates certain exceptions saying rights can be settled and so on. And why I'm saying that in particular that it's not rights-based is because one of the key features of having human rights is that when there's a right, there is a correlated duty that the state has. And the correlated duty that the state has from, if you look at international human rights law, for example, is that there's a right, there's a duty of the state to respect, protect, and promote the human rights, right? So it's three sort of things that the state is supposed to do. So in that sense, in India, and I, like sort of combed through a little bit, and also all of the laws that you referred to in the slides as well, in all of them, really like the only place where there is a rights-based approach, especially in protected areas, but all forest land in general, is in the Forest Rights Act. That is really the only place where there is actually some acknowledgement that the right of settlement, forest produce, fishing, grazing, whatever the rights are that is under the forest rights, as well as conservation, has a consequent duty of the state to protect and promote those rights, not just to respect those rights. So that's really like the only place where there is a framework for those rights to be implemented. In terms of implementation, I think a lot has been said, and I think Manish and Madhegowda ji have spoken a lot about what the implementation of, especially like what the FRA and all looks like. But I think, like for me, sort of legally, institutionally, I also see some slightly structural issues in terms of why the implementation gaps exist. And one of those is that, and this is not just in the forest context, this is sort of more broadly, but the state acts in three very conflicting roles. So the state is required and expected to be the protector of the rights, so under the Forest Rights Act. But the state is also expected to penalize people for doing offenses in forest areas and in protected areas. And the state is also expected and required to make money from forest areas and in protected areas. So there is a lot of, land and commerce that goes on in protected areas as well, right? I mean, tourism is one of them, but there is quite a few of other things that happen. And all of these three roles are conflicting. Some of them are held by the exact same department, which is quite often the forest department, which is holding multiple roles. And even where, for example, when the role, I mean, so the FRA sits within the Tribal Affairs Ministry, but so there is this like institutional conflict, or there is rather like a almost like a philosophical conflict of what is the point, like what are we trying to sort of do with this piece of land that we're calling a protected area, right? And I think that sort of in reality also then turns into things like where quite often, even when there is the forest department working with communities, they often tend to treat communities as laborers. And this has been like the critique of the Joint Forest Management and Eco-Development Committees. And this is a critique that sort of continues even today, right? I remember in 2019, I think, or when I was working in Rameshwaram, they wanted to start ecotourism on one of the islands where fishers used to use those. They were stopped from using those islands, and they were going to start ecotourism in those islands. And the fisheries department, the forest department's main sort of complaint was that the community doesn't want to work with us. We are really trying. We have gone to them. We have tried speaking to them. We've gotten an NGO who's, trying to like have this conversation with them, but it's just becoming really difficult. The fishers' perspective was they want to treat us as boat drivers. We don't want to be boat drivers. We are willing to participate in the ecotourism. We want to participate in it, but we're not going to be laborers for the forest department. We kind of want equal rights. But that sort of conversation in terms of institutionally, where does ownership lie, where does commerce lie, what does participation actually looks like, becomes very complex, right? And I think Madhigauda brought up he brought up fire, and this has been again like I think a thing that's the conversation that's happening everywhere. One of the champions that we work with works in Melghat, and he talks about how the Korkus also talk about fire as an important management tool, and something that you hear across not just India but everywhere. But there is again like I think there is that gap. There is that structural gap in terms of of sort of internalizing a human rights perspective or a human rights approach into all of the kind of laws that work in protected areas. And that has to also include conservation, right? Which I think there's some language for that. I mean, there's language for that in the target 3 that you were talking about, but it doesn't have it doesn't have a very similar language in conservation laws within India. So again, like the FRA becomes like the only space which actually has a very clear articulation of those rights in very particular situations. In terms of coexistence, so I think coexistence is complex because it's not a particular model. The way we really think of coexistence is that it's an everyday negotiation, and it's never a fixed thing. Like it sort of is, differs from day to day, from context to context. And honestly, like, so in terms of what does coexistence look like in protected areas, I think communities fighting for having like their FRA like lands declared and doing CFR management plans and fighting for CFR management plans is coexistence. And also, I mean, again, there have been examples that have been given of conservation that that the others have talked about as well. And this is sort of everywhere. I mean, we have Amir Hamza, who's working near the Govind Pashu Vihar Wildlife Sanctuary, for example, looking at how grazing could potentially be actually helping to regenerate forests. It could be in Kuno, the Sahariya Adivasis who have been relocated have been, them attempting to try and hold on to and revive some of the knowledge and traditions that their sort of ancestors have had. That also sort of looks at coexistence. So in that sense of there kind of is coexistence everywhere in many ways, and not just with Adivasi communities. I think that it's more of an acceptance of what it's more of a question of whether the forest department, the government, conservation organizations, human rights organizations, whatever, all of the civil society as well, is able to sort of accept this fundamental understanding of humans and wildlife can live together in different negotiated ways, not always without conflict. There can often be conflict, but the alienation is not necessary. And then the idea of, again, like the idea of protecting and promoting human rights, as opposed to just an instrumentalist sort of approach of we protect forest rights for the sake, we protect rights so that people will conserve. And that cannot, so that can't be like sort of our only approach. And the only one other additional thing I had to say was one of the
Stella,
rights
one more minute. Yeah.
yeah.
One more
I'm just
minute.
going to
Yeah.
end. I'm just going to
Yeah.
end on this one.
Yeah.
Which is that because Manish brought up the Jarawa reserves, and this was something that I was so under the Forest Rights Act, I forget the section right now, but yeah, Section 3E actually there was a specific section that talked about indigenous territories and habitats, what they were called, right? But habitat rights and this idea of 26% of territories overlap with indigenous territories, habitat rights were meant as being something even broader than community rights. And that seems to have completely and fully largely fallen off the map and the table at all. Everybody has forgotten that this section kind of even exists. And there are specificities for where it can go. But again, I think that when we're talking about, and I think Target 3 specifically talks about recognition of the tenurial rights of indigenous communities and the habitations of these spaces. I think so. I just want to bring Section 3E back onto the table to say that is one that's one thing that seems to be completely untouched in the last several years of implementation of the FRA. And I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Stella. Well timed. And thank you for your observations. Those are very interesting insights. We would now like to welcome, last but not the least, Neema Pathak. Neema is a member of Kalpavriksha and program coordinator of its Conservation and Livelihoods program. And she has worked extensively on community conservation and alternative approaches to conservation, including research and documentation, community self-strengthening, and advocacy for indigenous and local communities' access, use, management, and conservation rights. Neema, as you're aware, Target 3, along with other related targets, calls for conservation to be effective, equitable, and gender sensitive. So in that sense, how does Target 3 language align with the values and understandings of communities that you have observed over your career? Also, what does effective and equitable look like to communities if they were involved in conservation? Yeah, over to you, Neema.
Thank you, Shama, and also thank you to all the previous speakers. Very excellent sharing, a lot to think and reflect upon. So to your first question on whether it aligns with the values and principles of the communities, I think there are two very important elements to Target 3. Maybe I'll like to speak about that first. So first is that when we talk about 30% globally, Target 3 is now being understood largely, particularly indigenous movements, to be providing three main approaches to achieve conservation. Thus far, we have only heard about protected areas to be achieving conservation. In last few years, we heard about OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures that you were talking about. But now there is like a third primary pathway, which is recognition of indigenous and traditional territories, which we would also like to call ICCAs in our context. So many of the examples Manish was mentioning about the Jarawa Tribal Reserve in Andaman, so many of the reserves, such reserves and other areas can directly be recognized as ITTs or CCAs as per Target 3. The second very important point in Target 3 is that this 30% is not only just about coverage, but also by ensuring that all of these conservation efforts are effectively managed, there is equity, and by recognition of rights of Indigenous people and local communities that we've been talking about. And these two are very, very significant. In fact, recently there was a meeting on SubSTA, which is one of the subsidiary bodies of CBD, which revised its protected area program of work, taking into account these two very different approaches that KMGBF has accepted. But these significant changes didn't come just overnight by themselves, right? There's been a long history of struggle of Indigenous people participating in these negotiations and bit by bit, bringing these into the international policy forum. So from that point of view, it's very obvious that it aligns very well with Indigenous people's movements, both like Manish was saying earlier, in many cases, Indigenous people, local communities don't really see themselves as these conserving communities or managing communities. They basically say that it's by living the way we are living, conservation is achieved. And that's the model. Not only do we need to follow in our own areas, but it's something that we need to extend beyond our areas. I think somewhere relating to what Dr. Pradeep was saying, the whole model of conservation is changing. So how can we actually impact the model of conservation with this worldview? So it aligns very well with that, and it also aligns very well with the movements of recognition of rights of Indigenous people and local communities. To your second question on effective and equitable conservation, what it would look like if communities were to define it for themselves. So when communities are looking at their areas, they're actually not only looking at ecological indicators like species number and habitat restoration. That is indeed one of the elements, but that is not the only elements. Communities would be looking at what is the health of their decision-making system, like the governance system, the management system. What is their ability to continue the cultural and spiritual practices in that area? What is the ability to revitalize and sustain livelihoods? How can there be intergenerational sharing of knowledge? How can waters be protected? So these would be the various indicators for them other than species and habitat numbers and restoration. And similarly for equity, for them, it would not just be sharing of benefits coming from some conservation program, right? Equity would mean how secure the rights are, how strong the institutional and management systems are, how have they been able to address the internal discriminatory practices of gender, caste, and class. All of that would come within the elements of equity. And I think also like what Dr. Goda was saying earlier on, that when communities are not, a system in which communities are not merely consulted after the decisions have been taken, but very centrally involved, like through the processes that Dr. Pradeep was mentioning, and where people's own traditional knowledge-based management systems, like what the BRT community, the Solegas have been coming up with, get integrated or seen as effective conservation measures and included as such in the planning process. So, but having said that, I think it's also important to recognize, which I think all the speakers have touched upon, that we can't say like decades of colonial ways of doing things or the current model of development has also eroded many of internal systems of the communities, whether those are in decision-making processes, are highly politicized. They have weakened. As I was saying earlier on, there are caste, class, gender discrimination. So any system which is equitable and effective would also pay enormous amount of attention to have support structures which help communities to strengthen their systems where they are weakening, to revitalize their traditional knowledge, or even have collaboration with researchers from outside and local knowledge holders in generating knowledge which is more relevant to the current challenges being faced by the communities. So I think these would be the various elements importance of effective and equitable conservation from Indigenous peoples.
So, another question, like, because you've also been involved in some of the processes that are happening globally, what would meaningful recognition of these territories require beyond simply counting them towards 30% target? Because that seems to be the buzzword.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a very important question and a big fear actually in the minds of in many of the indigenous movements who participated in bringing about these changes globally. They also fear that this will become a number game about increasing coverage, about increasing protected area numbers, but not really about the quality of what is happening in these areas. And I think I really liked some of the points that Stella brought about, right? Clearly spelled out what is the need for an effective and meaningful policy in this context. And I think also it relates to what Dr. Pradeep was saying that, every time you talk about a government program coming up of conservation, there is fear and distrust in the mind of people. And it's because that's what our conservation policies have promoted thus far, that relationship of distrust. So a really meaningful recognition would actually mean developing a completely new conservation policy, which addresses some of the gaps and points that Stella was bringing about, including strong elements of grievance redressal, which doesn't exist in any of our policies thus far. Which also has very clearly, it kind of turns on its head, which says that if there is a strong custodianship and stewardship of local communities, it will have better conservation and climate mitigation outcomes. So that has to be at the base of that policy. I think that would be right space, and then the recognition of rights accordingly. And also the policy which moves away that from a narrative which has kind of got set saying that people cannot coexist with wildlife, and hence there has to be relocation from protected areas. So I think if there is a policy like that, for the foremost, I think restoring full range of collective and individual rights of indigenous people and local communities, which laws like FRA, PESA, and some others are trying to do, but also developing such laws where they don't exist. For example, for marine and coastal areas that Manish was talking about. So something similar to FRA for marine and coastal areas. Secondly is also what sustains these territories and makes custodianship effective are the local traditional governance systems. And if we have recognition of CCAs, but no recognition of traditional governance mechanisms, then it would undermine the mechanisms by which conservation has happened so far. And as I said earlier, where such systems are weakened, it's very important that our policy recognizes that and supports that process rather than further weakening it, further politicizing it, and deteriorating such mechanism. Third is, I think, a direct support to the communities for various kinds, but I'm specifically mentioning also financial, because what we have seen across, and I think Dr. Madegowda also mentioned it, that now they have this plan and they are going to Actor 1, Actor 2, Actor 3. Can you give us some funding to implement? It's unfortunate in some ways, because here's a community which has invested so much time and effort in developing a conservation plan. We should have mechanism by which such plan can be directly financed. And KMGBF talks about it, direct access, which may mean maybe amending laws like FCRA, so that communities can have some direct access to funding for enormous amount of time and effort that goes into developing conservation plans and implementing them, sustaining livelihoods that are associated with them. And I think the fourth meaningful recognition would also be when we are reporting target 3, then what we must value is what also the communities value. So not just reporting on what conservation achievement have been, great, of course they should be reported, but also how cultural vitality has been retained, what kind of nature-based livelihoods have been accepted. how the land use has changed in these territories, what external pressures these communities are facing. I think all of this should be part of the monitoring and reporting mechanism. And actually, with respect to target 22 of KMGBF, this is already being developed. And if there is an interest, we can probably share more about it later. But finally, just quickly to end, because I know we don't have time.
One more minute, please.
In conclusion, the real promise of target 3 is actually not about reaching out percentages and coverage of protected area, but I think the central question here is whether target 3 can contribute to continued vitality of communities' governance systems, knowledge generation systems, whether target 3 can help strengthen the stewardship of the local communities, including by questioning the model of development, as Dr. Pradeep had mentioned earlier on, and have a newer and kind of a radical approach to conservation than just following business as usual. So I would just end with that big dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Nima, and very helpful that you pulled it all together. Dr. Pradeep, would you need to leave currently?
Yes, if there is no question or something, I would be very happy to say goodbye. I have some more meetings in lined up.
So can we address like one question, Dr. Pradeep, and then we'll take a bio break for 5 minutes. And so one of the questions, I suppose you may have addressed this already, but I'd still just say it. What incentives can be provided to communities or especially private players to conserve their lands or manage their lands?
One way is to acquire the land. Like in certain cases, people have asked us that you please acquire our land because we are not doing any more farming there, but give us good price so that we will buy something somewhere else. That is one way they said. Secondly, we had a meeting. I said, rather than you selling the land to us, what if we make you part of the integrated development of that area? And you also be an important stakeholder so that by selling one time you earn X amount, but by protecting it for future, by connecting it with the livelihood and being a part of the integrated management plan. Suppose if we keep a controlled ecotourism or something, people come to visit that area and see, then you may have a small eatery there, small bird trail around that, a medicinal garden or butterfly garden, biodiversity park, something in your property where you also make some money and stay together for long, rather than we acquiring and government managing the whole land. That's another approach. Third, I feel is we are also looking at creating a corpus fund for those who are preserving green spaces in Goa. We are trying to create a mechanism where we could give them, incentivize them every time. That's what.
You're on mute, Dr. Pradeep.
Oh, I've been talking. Nobody heard me.
No. Just the last 5 seconds.
Okay. So I think the best way would be to involve them rather than one time compensating and, they should be a part of the success story. We should create a success story. We should all learn together and take it ahead rather than, acquiring it, putting a compound and locking it for conservation purpose. I think the best model of conservation is sustainable utilization and not just locking the thing. So with communities, if that place can evolve to be a better and better, more biodiverse reach, that is what we should look at doing. That's what from my side.
Thank you, sir. I mean, what you've told us is also quite visionary and quite, in fact, quite ingenious. And I hope that we wish you all success in your endeavors in Goa and hope that other states take note as well.
I'm so thankful to you for having me because I was very happy to listen to Chandi sir, Stella madam, and of course Nima madam and all the people who are there around. Of course, Roshni and those who are asking me many questions. I've tried to answer them. Whatever further, you can send me a mail.
I will send you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So with this, we come to the end of this panel discussion. We thank all our panelists for sharing such helpful perspectives. We would like to announce a short 5-minute bio break for everyone's benefit because we've been at it for a while. But I request you all to please come back. Attendees, also please take this time to add some questions if you'd like, further questions for the panelists. We will come back after a 5-minute break. So please join us and we'll take up all the questions. Thank you so much. Requesting everyone to please return, and we can now take up some questions that have been left by the audience. So the first question is to Manish. Manish, are you there?
Yes, coming online now, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. So Manish, it's a very simple question that's been posed, which is, in an ideal world, what kind of steps or mechanisms or changes would bring us closer to a more equitable and sustainable future? This is
Is
a
it there in the
philosophical
chat box?
question. Yeah, it was in the chat box. It's by Jeffrey.
Yeah, I'll just take a look at it outside.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't see it again. Yeah.
It's, I think, towards the end.
Yeah, what kind of steps or mechanisms or changes would bring us closer to a more equitable and sustainable future? I think, I mean, first of all, given the flavor and reason why this webinar is taking shape and place, not just that, but in actual fact, I believe, and I mean, a lot of us believe that there has been what conservation has been very inequitable, actually, the way it is functioned and kind of has evolved. And that inequity is because there's some who are kind of who have thought of an area of a need to conserve a particular species or an area over the which invariably or otherwise belongs to or is used by a set of others. And the two haven't been able to kind of find common ground in a sense. Now, what all of us in general are talking about is to bring or to create that sort of a common ground. This might demolish, might have to, there may be a need to demolish the conventional thinkings and formations of protected areas. And also of there's the other issue of use, consumable use of resources. In our modern day world, the first answer would be, yeah, it's a very dangerous kind of setup to kind of have resource use taking shape the way it took place 200 years ago and so on and so forth. I agree with that. But the point is, for a more equitable and sustainable future, I don't see much any other option apart from actually working with local communities and who may or may not include indigenous people as well. And I say that because not just because a lot of the conventional, more Western, which is also Indian now, formats of conservation by what has been referred to as fortress conservation. Dr. Madhigaud has a nice paper as a co-author in one of those papers called Fortress Conservation. They have failed, and they have resulted in so much of problems for various local communities as well as species, where antagonism has taken shape and so on and so forth. But the ideal world scenario would be of getting people on board, and especially those who live in those areas and who use those specific areas, to create the rules and to create or to figure out ways ahead and so on and so forth. Other than me and you who are sitting in a faraway place deciding for someone else in that sense. Our job would be more to facilitate those processes, I think. Is what I would advocate and kind of champion in a sense. The other also is of connectivity. I think it's part of the same question or to somewhere else, I think.
That's another question.
Another question. Okay. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Manish. That is how we should all be looking at it, even as practitioners. Next question is to Nima. So one of the important aspects of Target 3, often overlooked, is connectivity. So how are we measuring or taking into consideration connectivity or corridors? And how can this be coupled with local stewardship, as often these areas overlap with traditional territories?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important point because it often gets overlooked in effectivity and equity concerns. Connectivity is a very, very important point that Target 3 brings about. And actually, it connects very well with Indigenous articulations also, or local communities articulations also, because very often people talk about biocultural connectivity because whenever there are, when we are talking about landscapes, we try to fragment them into villages, into districts, and those administrative boundaries, without looking at their ecological and cultural connectivities. So there was in fact an effort by one of the works that was happening in Kalpavriksha, where trying to map the biocultural zones within India, and then see how they overlay with conservation models. So I think very important in all the spaces that we are talking about, there have to be cultural connections also, seeing that can make the process more effective.
Thank you, Nima.
Can I add
Next
to that a
question.
little bit?
Yeah, Manish. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, all I wanted to say was, see, in terms of when I thought of connectivity, we often tend to, I mean, it's a bias, and it's very often that people tend to associate forests or places which are vegetated by trees as that which affords connectivity from place A to place B. And on the other hand, there are other landscapes as well, like grasslands, meadows, pasture lands, which are also connecting protected areas. A classic example, or I mean, very easily known by most of us who follow or are interested in wildlife conservation and so on, is of tigers moving from over 200 to 300 kilometers, from moving through towns, villages, and so on, highways and so on and so forth. I mean, large mammals such as a tiger. Elephants, of course, do that as well. We also have small insects like dragonflies and birds and whatnot, which also fly across various landscapes. So connectivity is there as long as we are able to accept it and afford that space for such species of wildlife to actually be able to connect. At the same time, some years ago when I was in a different association, there also I learned of the fact of how dams, water bodies, canals, etc., can actually disrupt that sort of connectivity, or rather even create islands or create I wouldn't say call them enclosures where animals like elephants are enclosed, not able to move because of water bodies all around and stuff like that. We're actually disrupting a connective space or a corridor and so on and so forth. And it's again, with talking about local communities, we have to include the whole gamut of people, from indigenous or tribal communities, herders, pastoralists who use these landscapes and have been using it for centuries and very often. And their tenure has been disrupted because of our own very colonial attitude towards such spaces, especially in terms of use. Now, resource use is always generally seen very negatively. And that, I'm not saying it has to change overnight, but we have to have a better understanding of how these take shape. And it is happening across the world in other parts, as well as in some parts of India as well. And what Nima was also referring to earlier on, there are those spaces. We have to be open to having these spaces which are both urban and semi or peri-urban or peri-rural or whatever they are, as corridors that help wildlife or biodiversity to be able to connect one from the other.
Thank you, Manish and Nima. Next question is to Stella. So, in the Indian context, how can we look at co-governance when there is a significant power asymmetry between government institutions and communities? Because, as you mentioned, they work through hierarchical structures, right? So while communities are often treated as beneficiaries or stakeholders, how do you raise them up to becoming an equal rights stakeholder? Still.
So, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My answer to this is actually that I don't think co-governance in that sense works. I think it has to be a model of decentralization where communities hold the power and the rights and the responsibilities, and the state acts as a facilitator. I think co-governance models, I mean, we've seen how JFMCs have worked. Even with FRA, we've seen the kind of power that the department has sort of been using. So I don't think the framework can or even should be co-governance. I think the Constitution already provides for recognition of, Gram Sabhas, but also I think there is definitely scope for recognizing the governance, the traditional governance models, or even the modern governance models that Nima was talking about. And communities do, as everybody has spoken, large parts of the country have been conserved because of communities who've done this through existing governance models, and in some cases through new governance models or through governance, traditional governance models that have been sort of changed or modified for this to happen, right? And the influence of these governance systems is fairly extensive as well within those communities, right? So up until, I'm not sure what the situation is right now, but for example, in the fisheries space, purse signing in parts of Maharashtra and in parts of in Tamil Nadu were sort of stopped by Ur Panchayats and by sort of fisheries governance models that were not recognized. So I don't think the way to go is to have to try and get the state and communities to work together in one institution, because the way the hierarchy works right now, I don't think that's possible. I think the way to do that is to very actively flip the power dynamic, and actually it's almost just an implementation. Like in law, in the Constitution, that decentralization exists. It's really about then making that decentralization actually be the principle on which this is based, right? And we don't have a legal, like beyond the Constitution, except for some recognition of commons under, say, the Jagpal Singh case was one example where the commons was recognized. But except for some recognition of the commons here and there, that recognition doesn't really exist in the law. So I would see it as a governance model that is led by the communities.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So it's to you, Nima. In many parts of India, gender and caste-based discrimination is prevalent in traditional societies and customary institutions. So how can these be addressed?
Yeah, again,
While carrying out conservation, of course. Yeah.
Again, a very good question. And I think, as I had mentioned earlier, that many of these are thousands-year-old traditions. But and they have to be addressed because it's for the communities, not just for conservation, like overall well-being of the community itself. These issues have to be resolved. They're not directly related to conservation per se. And unless these are resolved, very often many of the communities' ability to do any of the meaningful work for the society fail. So in many societies where communities are coming together and organizing themselves, it's something which is realized. And we have examples like, I would give an example of this community in Gadchiroli in Kochi Taluka, where women were at the forefront of fighting against mining, or still are. But when it came to decision making, once they got the rights under the Forest Rights Act, their voice was limited or invisible. So the struggle to find a space in the institution of conservation or resource management then also led to them questioning the Jat Panchayats, where women were not included in the justice system. So I think these are movements that throughout the society, I wouldn't say just in conservation areas, we have a collective work of strengthening the voices which are traditionally weakened. It's a collective work across. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't delegitimize a conservation initiative for a tradition which is across the entire society. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, no, for the future of conservation, as well as we say, human rights-based approach, it's important for us to address all these issues equally and not just isolate conservation. Yeah, so I think with that, yeah, Nima. Yeah.
Also wanted to mention that within KMGBF, actually there is a target that specifically addresses that. Target 23 talks about gender-based gender voices to be included in across all elements of KMGBF.
Right, Lisa. Yeah, so I think with that, we are coming to an end of this session. I thank the panelists, all our attendees for sitting for so long and listening to us, engaging with us on these questions, these very important questions. We also are very grateful to our Hindi translator, Ms. Nidhi, who's done a very efficient translation. This video is being recorded as we're speaking, and we hope to put this up on YouTube shortly, and where everyone else can watch it. We are also, so any unaddressed questions that we could not take up in this Q&A due to paucity of time, we will do our best to follow up with the panelists and also to follow up with the people who asked those questions. We hope to engage on this issue further and hoping for all of your participation in the next webinar as well, which is the date for which will be shortly announced. With that, I thank everyone once again, and we are closing the session officially. Thank you all.